The alley stretched before Maya Chen like a narrow throat, swallowing the amber glow of streetlights into its depths. Steam rose from manholes and ghostly spirals, carrying the scent of rain-soaked concrete and something else, something metallic that made her pulse quicken. Her worn leather messenger bag pressed against her hip as she quickened her pace. The familiar weight of her laptop and the stack of incident reports inside, a reminder of why she was walking these streets at 11:47 p.m. instead of safe in her apartment. The men materialized from the shadows like smoke given form. 5 of them, arranged in a loose semicircle that blocked the narrow passage between the brick buildings. Maya's hand instinctively moved to the small canister clipped to her keychain, but her mind was already calculating angles, distances, and the placement of a fire escape ladder 15 feet behind her. "Well, well," the tallest one drawled, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "What do we have here? Little lady walking all alone in our neighborhood." Maya stopped walking. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic on the main street and the steady drip of water from a fire escape above. In that moment, she cataloged everything. The way the leader favored his right leg, the nervous energy of the youngest one on the left, the broken glass scattered near the dumpster that would crunch under retreating feet. You boys picked the wrong night, and definitely the wrong woman. What happened next would be talked about in hushed whispers for years to come. 90 seconds that would reshape everything, not just for Maya Chen, but for an entire community that had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally push back against the darkness that had been swallowing their streets one shadow at a time. But to understand those 90 seconds, you have to understand Maya Chen. You have to know about the 13 years she'd spent learning to turn her body into something more than flesh and bone. You have to know about her grandmother's weathered hands teaching her that strength wasn't about size, but about knowing exactly where to apply pressure. You have to know about the stack of reports in her bag, 27 documented incidents of women being harassed, threatened, or worse in this very neighborhood over the past 6 months. Maya had been walking these streets for 3 weeks now, at the same time every night, carrying the same bag, wearing the same route like a prayer. She was hunting in her own way, not for violence. She'd had enough violence in her life to know it was never the answer she reached for first. She was hunting for truth, for patterns, for the moment that she could finally pull back the curtain on what everyone in Little Harbor knew, but nobody could prove. The neighborhood had a heartbeat once. Maya remembered it from her childhood visits to her grandmother's apartment on Moore Street. The sound of children playing in pocket parks, the smell of Mrs. Rodriguez's empanadas drifting from her kitchen window, the way elderly men gathered around chess tables in the small plaza near the subway entrance. Her grandmother, Popo, had been one of the community's quiet guardians, the woman people came to when landlords got too aggressive or when teenagers needed someone to believe in them. But Popo was gone now, buried 3 years ago in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the harbor. And the neighborhood had changed. The children played indoors now. Mrs. Rodriguez kept her windows closed. The chess table sat empty, gathering dust and the occasional empty bottle. Maya's messenger bag contained more than just incident reports. Tucked between the pages were photographs, before and after shots she'd taken during her evening walks. The vibrant mural on Cedar Street, now tagged with crude symbols that made her stomach turn. The community garden where Popo used to grow bok choy and chrysanthemums, now trampled and littered with broken bottles. The small shrine to Santo Niño that had stood at the corner of Morse and 3rd for 40 years, now defaced with spray paint that spoke of hatred in multiple languages. She'd been documenting it all, building a case that went beyond individual incidents to show the systematic campaign of intimidation that was hollowing out Little Harbor from the inside. The police reports she'd filed had disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. The community meetings she'd organized had been interrupted by construction noise and permit issues. Even the local newspaper had stopped returning her calls after she'd started connecting dots between the harassment and a series of property acquisitions by Meridian Holdings, a development company that seemed very interested in buying up Little Harbor real estate at below-market prices. The 5 men blocking her path weren't random. Maya had seen them before, photographed them from a distance as they'd followed other women, intimidated shop owners, and made their presence felt like a toxic cloud. They were foot soldiers in a war most people didn't even realize was being fought. "You hear that, boys?" The leader grinned, revealing teeth stained yellow by too many cigarettes. "She thinks she picked us." He stepped closer, and Maya could smell the bourbon on his breath mixing with cheap cologne. "Lady, you don't seem to understand the situation you're in." Maya shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. Men, strength is like water. It finds the weakness, flows around the hardness, and wears down mountains one drop at a time. Preparing and narrating this story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you were enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The man to her left, stocky, with arms like tree trunks and hands that looked more comfortable wrapped around a beer bottle than anything requiring finesse, cracked his knuckles. "Maybe we should teach her some manners." "Maybe," Maya said quietly. "Maybe you should walk away." She meant it, despite everything. The weeks of documenting their harassment, the sleepless nights spent researching property records and police reports, and the growing anger that burned in her chest like a pilot light. Maya had learned long ago that violence was a language everyone could speak, but few could control once the conversation started. The youngest one, barely out of his teens, with nervous eyes that kept darting toward the street, shifted uncomfortably. "Look, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Tommy." The leader's voice cracked like a whip. "You talk when I say you talk." Tommy. Maya filed the name away, along with the obvious fear in his voice, the way he stood slightly apart from the others. Information was power, and she was always collecting both. Behind the 5 men, deeper in the alley, Maya could see the outline of a loading dock where she had watched them conduct other business. Packages changing hands, money flowing in directions that didn't match any legitimate commerce she could identify. The alley wasn't just a hunting ground, it was their office, their territory, their kingdom of shadows. The building to her right was the old Sunrise laundromat, closed now for 8 months after Mrs. Kim had decided it was too dangerous to keep operating. The windows were boarded up, but Maya could see the faint outline of the colorful children's drawings that had once decorated the glass. Stick figures holding hands under crayon suns, rainbows arcing over houses that looked like hope rendered in primary colors. Those drawings had been Mrs. Kim's idea, a way to brighten up the neighborhood and give the local kids something positive to focus on. Maya remembered helping to hang them up during a community beautification day 2 years ago, Popo translating between Mrs. Kim's Korean and the Spanish-speaking families who'd brought their children to participate. Now, those drawings were hidden behind plywood that bore fresh scratches, territorial markings left by people who wanted everyone to know that beauty was no longer welcome here. "You know what I think?" The leader took another step closer, close enough now that Maya could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way her pupils were slightly dilated despite the bright streetlight. I think you've been poking around where you don't belong, asking questions that don't concern you." So they knew who I was, had probably known all along. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air, but her voice remained steady. Questions like why women can't walk home safely, questions like why businesses are closing and families are moving away. The man directly in front of her, medium height, wearing a leather jacket that had seen better decades, laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You college types are all the same. Think you can come into a neighborhood and save it from itself." "I grew up in this neighborhood," Maya said. "My grandmother lived here for 43 years. "Past tense," the leader noted with a smile that made Maya's skin crawl. "Things change. Old ways die out. New management takes over." New management. The phrase hit Maya like a physical blow, confirming what she'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove. These men weren't just random predators. They were part of something organized, something deliberate. The systematic erosion of Little Harbor wasn't happening by accident. In her bag, along with the incident reports and photographs, was a thick manila folder labeled Meridian Holdings, Property Acquisition Timeline. Maya had spent weeks at the city records office tracing ownership changes, permit applications, and zoning variances. The pattern was subtle but undeniable. Properties were being acquired at significant discounts after extended periods of community degradation. It was a business model as old as gentrification itself, but with a modern twist. Instead of waiting for neighborhoods to decline naturally, Meridian was accelerating the process. Create enough fear, drive out enough families, close enough businesses, and eventually the community would collapse under its own weight. Then swoop in as the savior, offering below-market prices for distressed properties and promising to revitalize the area. The revitalization would come, of course, but it wouldn't be for the families who'd called Little Harbor home for generations. It would be for young professionals looking for authentic urban living experiences and investors seeking properties in emerging neighborhoods close to downtown. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text message that she couldn't check without taking her eyes off the 5 men, but she knew it was probably from Sandra Martinez, her closest friend and the one person who knew where Maya was tonight. Sandra would be checking in, making sure Maya was safe, probably trying to talk her out of this entire plan for the 100th time. Sandra worked as a victim's advocate at the county courthouse, and she'd seen too many cases of women who'd tried to fight back only to find themselves facing a system that was more interested in maintaining order than ensuring justice. "The system is broken, Maya," she'd said just last week over coffee at their usual spot on Bleecker Street. "But getting yourself hurt isn't going to fix it." But Maya had tried working within the system. She'd filed police reports that disappeared. She had attended city council meetings where her 3 minutes of public comment was drowned out by developers with expensive lawyers and carefully prepared presentations. She'd written letters to the mayor's office that received form letter responses promising to look into the matter. Meanwhile, women continued to be harassed, families continued to move away, businesses continued to close, and Little Harbor continued to hollow out, one intimidated resident at a time. The leader was talking again, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something to a slow child. "See, the thing is, we've been watching you. Know your routine, know where you live, where you work, where you get your morning coffee." Maya's apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up on the other side of the neighborhood, close enough to Little Harbor to feel connected, but far enough away to be safe. Or so she'd thought. The fact that they'd been watching her meant they knew about her job at the legal aid clinic downtown, knew about her weekend visits to Popo's grave, probably even knew about Sandra. "You work at that clinic on State Street. Help people file lawsuits they can't afford. Very noble." They'd done their homework. I wondered how long they'd been building a file on her, what other information they'd gathered, who else they might be watching. The thought sent ice through her veins, but also crystallized her resolve. If they were going to this much trouble to intimidate her, it meant she was close to something they wanted to keep hidden. The broken glass near the dumpster caught the streetlight, sending small rainbows dancing across the wet pavement. Maya found herself thinking about Popo's hands, weathered and strong, teaching her to fold wontons in the tiny kitchen of the Morse Street apartment. Those same hands had shown her how to find the pressure points that could stop pain or cause it, how to use an attacker's weight against them, how to move like water and strike like lightning. But Popo had also taught her patience, the value of waiting for the right moment, and the importance of understanding your enemy before you engaged them. "Wisdom is knowing when to fight, Min Min," she'd said in her mixture of English and Mandarin. "And wisdom is also knowing how to win when fighting becomes necessary." Maya's phone buzzed again. Sandra, definitely Sandra, probably getting worried. In a few hours, if Maya didn't check in, Sandra would call the police. But Maya knew that by the time help arrived, whatever was going to happen here would be long over. The youngest man, Tommy, was still standing slightly apart from the group, his eyes darting between Maya and his companions with increasing nervousness. He kept glancing toward the street, as if hoping someone would walk by, interrupt this moment, give him an excuse to leave. Maya made a mental note of his positioning, his obvious discomfort. In any confrontation, he would be either the first to run or the most likely to make a mistake. Either way, he was a variable she could use. The man in the leather jacket pulled out a cigarette and lit it with theatrical slowness, the flame from his lighter casting dancing shadows on the brick walls. "You know what's funny about do-gooders like you?" he said, taking a long drag. "You always think you're the hero of the story." "And you always think you're the victims," Maya replied. The leader's smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "Lady, you have no idea what you're dealing with." But Maya did know. She'd spent 3 weeks learning their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. She knew that the leader favored his right leg because of an old injury. She'd watched him favor it during their previous encounters. She knew that the stocky man's reach was impressive, but his balance was questionable, especially after he'd been drinking. She knew that the man in the leather jacket was left-handed and kept his keys in his back pocket where they would interfere with his movement. Most importantly, she knew they were used to intimidating people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. They were used to victims who would cower, plead, try to bargain their way out of trouble. Maya Chen was not that kind of victim. The alley seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, police or ambulance, heading towards someone else's emergency. A cat knocked over a trash can lid in a neighboring courtyard, the metallic clang echoing off the brick walls like a starting gun. "You know what's funny about do-gooders like you?" the leader said, dropping his cigarette and grinding it under his heel. "You always think you're the hero of the story." "And you always think you're the victims," Maya replied. Maya shifted her messenger bag to her left shoulder, freeing up her right hand. Her grandmother's ring, a simple band of white gold with a small jade stone, caught the light on her finger. Popo had worn that ring for 60 years, through war and immigration, poverty and prosperity, raising children and burying a husband. "My grandmother used to tell me a story," Maya said quietly, "about a small fish that lived in a pond controlled by 5 big fish. They told the small fish where she could swim, what she could eat, when she could come to the surface for air. The men were listening despite themselves, drawn in by the unexpected shift in tone. One day, the small fish decided she'd had enough. And you know what happened to those 5 big fish?" The leader's eyes narrowed. "What?" Maya smiled, and for the first time since entering the alley, she felt the familiar calm that preceded action, the stillness that came just before water became a tsunami. They learned that the pond was never theirs to begin with. Maya's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m. every morning, but she was usually awake before it sounded. The habit came from childhood. Popo had always believed that the best part of the day happened in the quiet hours before the world woke up, when you could hear your own thoughts and plan your moves without interference. The apartment on Fletcher Street was a study in organized minimalism. Maya had learned long ago that possessions could become anchors, weighing you down when you needed to move quickly or think clearly. But there were exceptions. Popo's jade ring that never left her finger, a framed photograph of her parents taken before the accident when she was 12, and the small altar in the corner where incense burned each morning beside offerings of oranges and tea. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. 20 minutes of Tai Chi in the narrow living room, the forms flowing like water as her body remembered lessons learned in Popo's apartment 2 decades ago. Shower, dress in the careful uniform of respectability. Dark slacks, button-down shirt, blazer that concealed more than it revealed. Coffee black, oatmeal with honey, news on the radio kept low enough not to disturb the neighbors. But this morning was different. This morning, Maya's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the ghost of a smile that had been haunting her face since she'd walked out of that alley 3 days ago. The 5 men had woken up 20 minutes later to find themselves zip-tied to various pieces of urban furniture, with a note tucked into the leader's jacket pocket. Consider this a warning. Next time, I won't be so gentle. The local news had picked up the story, though they'd gotten most of the details wrong. 5 men hospitalized after an apparent gang fight, the anchor had reported, showing footage of the men loading them into ambulances. Police are investigating the incident but have no suspects at this time. Maya had watched from her apartment, Sandra beside her on the couch with a bag of popcorn and an expression that mixed admiration with terror. You realize Sandra had said around a mouthful of kernels that you've just painted a target on your back the size of Texas. But Maya felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time since moving back to Little Harbor, she'd acted instead of reacted. She'd stopped being a collector of evidence and become something more active, more dangerous to the people who'd been systematically destroying her grandmother's neighborhood. The walk to work took her through the heart of Little Harbor, past the shuttered storefronts and abandoned lots that told the story of community decline. But this morning, Maya noticed things she'd missed before, or things that were genuinely new. Mrs. Rodriguez had her window open again, the smell of fresh empanadas drifting onto Moore Street for the first time in weeks. 2 elderly men were setting up a chessboard in the small plaza near the subway entrance, their movements careful but determined. And on the wall where the worst graffiti had been, someone had painted over the hate speech with a simple message in multiple languages. "This is our home. We are not afraid." Maya's phone rang as she was examining the new mural. Sandra's name appeared on the screen along with the photo they'd taken last summer at a beach trip that now seemed like it had happened in someone else's life. "Please tell me you're not planning to make a habit of this," Sandra said without preamble. "Good morning to you too." Maya shifted the phone to her left ear, freeing up her right hand to take notes as she walked. Old habit from her reporter days, before law school, before she decided that writing about problems wasn't enough. "Maya, I'm serious. I spent half the night researching those guys you encountered. They're not just random street toughs. 2 of them have connections to bigger organizations, and the one you left hanging from the fire escape, his uncle is Vincent Torrino." Maya stopped walking. Vincent Torrino was a name that appeared in whispered conversations around the courthouse, usually in connection with labor disputes that got resolved quickly and quietly, or development projects that faced mysteriously little community opposition. "How big is his uncle?" Maya asked. "Big enough that you should be having this conversation from somewhere that isn't Little Harbor, like maybe Montana or another continent." Maya resumed walking, but slower now, her eyes scanning the street with renewed attention. She'd known that her actions would have consequences, but she'd been thinking locally. Retaliation from the 5 men themselves, maybe escalation from whatever organization they worked for. She hadn't considered the possibility that she'd accidentally declared war on someone with the resources to make her disappear permanently. "Maya? Are you still there?" "I'm here. Just thinking." "Good. Think about coming to stay with me for a while. I've got that pull-out couch, and my building has decent security." Maya turned the corner onto State Street, where the legal aid clinic occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone. The building was over 100 years old, with high ceilings and large windows that let in floods of natural light. She'd been working there for 2 years, helping low-income residents navigate legal problems that ranged from landlord disputes to immigration issues. The work was meaningful but frustrating, like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon. For every family she helped avoid eviction, 3 more were pushed out by rent increases they couldn't afford. For every predatory lender she stopped, 2 more opened up shop in different neighborhoods. "I can't run away from this, Sandra. You can't fight the entire world either." Maya pushed through the glass doors of the clinic, nodding to Marcus, the security guard who'd been there longer than anyone could remember. Marcus was in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes, but Maya had seen him handle aggressive visitors with the quiet competence of someone who'd learned his skills in places where mistakes were permanent. "I'm not trying to fight the entire world," Maya said, settling into her cubicle with its view of the street. "Just the part that's trying to destroy my neighborhood." Sandra sighed, a sound that carried 2 decades of friendship and the accumulated weight of too many conversations about Maya's tendency to take on impossible challenges. "Do you remember what happened to your last impossible challenge?" Maya's hand moved unconsciously to the thin scar along her collarbone, hidden beneath her shirt. David Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had been a city councilman with big ambitions and flexible ethics. Maya had been a young journalist who'd stumbled onto evidence of a kickback scheme involving construction contracts. The story had won awards and ended David Chen's political career. It had also ended Maya's journalism career when she'd been attacked in her apartment one night by 2 men who'd wanted to make sure she understood the consequences of asking inconvenient questions. The physical scars had healed. The deeper wounds, the knowledge that doing the right thing could make you a target, that justice often came with a price tag most people couldn't afford, had driven her away from journalism and toward law school. "This is different," Maya said. "Is it, or are you just older and more dangerous now?" Before Maya could answer, her first client of the day arrived, Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 70s, who was being evicted from the apartment she'd lived in for 25 years. The landlord claimed she was behind on rent, but Maya had discovered that Mrs. Patterson's checks were being cashed and then reported as never received. It was a common scam, especially targeting elderly tenants who might not have the energy or resources to fight back. Maya had been working on Mrs. Patterson's case for 6 weeks, building a paper trail that proved the landlord's deception. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. P?" Maya asked, guiding the older woman to a chair. "Scared," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "Got another notice yesterday. They want me out by Friday." Maya opened the thick file folder that contained Mrs. Patterson's case. Bank statements, copies of checks, correspondence with the landlord's management company, photographs of Mrs. Patterson's apartment showing its excellent condition despite claims of tenant damage. "We're going to fight this," Maya said. "I've got everything we need to prove they're lying." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "But what if they come after me? To fight back? My neighbor, Mrs. Kim? She tried to fight when they wanted to close her laundry. I had all sorts of troubles after that. Broken windows, threatening phone calls." Maya looked up from the file. "Mrs. Kim? From the Sunrise Laundromat? You knew her?" "My grandmother used to take me there when I was little." Maya remembered the small woman with calloused hands who'd always slipped extra dryer sheets into Popo's bag, who'd hung children's artwork in her windows and kept a jar of hard candy on the counter for anyone who needed a small sweetness in their day. "She was a good woman," Mrs. Patterson said. "But after she tried to fight the closure, things got bad for her. Really bad." Maya added Mrs. Kim's story to the growing file in her mind, another piece of the pattern she'd been documenting. The systematic intimidation wasn't just about clearing the streets. It was about clearing out anyone who might resist the neighborhood's transformation. "Mrs. Patterson," Maya said carefully, "has anyone approached you directly? Made threats or suggestions about moving?" The older woman's eyes darted toward the window, then back to Maya's face. "There was a man, young fellow, very polite. Came by last week with some papers." "What kind of papers?" "Said his company buys properties from people in difficult situations. Cash offers, no questions asked. He left his card." Mrs. Patterson dug through her purse and produced a business card that made Maya's blood run cold. Meridian Holdings, with a phone number and an address in the financial district downtown. "Did he say anything else?" "Just that it might be easier than fighting in court, less stressful." Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper. "He knew things, Miss Chen. Knew about my late husband's medical bills. Knew about the problems with my Social Security. How would he know those things?" Maya photographed the business card with her phone, then handed it back to Mrs. Patterson. "We're definitely fighting this, and I want you to call me if anyone else approaches you, okay?" After Mrs. Patterson left, Maya stared at the photograph of the business card on her phone. The same company that had been systematically acquiring distressed properties throughout Little Harbor was now directly targeting residents with legal troubles, offering cash buyouts that would allow them to swoop in and purchase buildings at below-market prices. It was elegant in its simplicity. Create problems for tenants, then offer solutions that benefited only Meridian Holdings. The harassment campaign wasn't just about intimidation, it was about forced sales. Maya's next 3 clients told similar stories. The Anayan family, facing eviction after their landlord claimed they were violating occupancy limits by housing elderly relatives. Maria Santos, whose small restaurant was being cited for health code violations that seemed to appear and disappear depending on which inspectors showed up. Tommy Wright, a veteran trying to start a small repair shop who was being strangled by permit requirements that changed every time he tried to comply. All of them had been approached by polite representatives of Meridian Holdings. All of them had been offered cash buyouts. All of them were scared. By lunchtime, Maya had filled 17 pages of notes with connections, patterns, and evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond simple street harassment. She walked to the small park behind the clinic, needing air and space to think. The park was one of Popo's favorite places, a pocket of green in the urban landscape with benches arranged around a small fountain that usually worked. Maya sat on the bench where she and her grandmother used to feed ducks and tried to process what she'd learned. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. "Lunch? Need to talk to you about something." They met at Giuseppe's, a hole-in-the-wall Italian place that had somehow survived every wave of gentrification that had swept through the downtown area. Sandra was already waiting in their usual booth, her expression serious. "I did some more research on your new friends," Sandra said without preamble, "and I found something you need to know." She slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were police reports, court documents, and newspaper clippings that painted a picture of escalating violence throughout the city. 3 other neighborhoods, Sandra said. Same pattern, same company, same results. Maya flipped through the documents. Riverside, where a community organizer named James Wheeler had been found dead in his apartment after raising questions about property acquisitions. Eastgate, where a series of random break-ins had targeted anyone who'd spoken out at city council meetings. Millfield, where the community center had burned down the night before a big meeting about fighting a development project. "Jesus," Maya whispered. "It gets worse. James Wheeler, the medical examiner ruled it suicide, but 3 witnesses saw 2 men leaving his building the night he died. The break-ins in Eastgate, no arrests, despite clear patterns and multiple suspects identified by victims. The fire in Millfield, electrical problem according to the official report." Maya felt the world shifting around her, like stepping onto a boat in rough weather. She thought she was dealing with local thugs, maybe some organized harassment. She hadn't realized she'd stumbled into something that had already left bodies in its wake. "The 5 guys you encountered, they're small potatoes, foot soldiers. The real power is up the chain, and they don't leave witnesses." "So what are you saying? Should I back down?" Sandra reached across the table and took Maya's hands. "I'm saying that whatever you're planning to do next, you can't do it alone. And you can't do it the same way you've been doing it." Maya looked down at their joined hands. Sandra's were soft, manicured, the hands of someone who fought battles with words and legal documents. Maya's were harder, marked with small scars from years of martial arts training and the calluses that came from knowing how to use tools and weapons. What if I don't back down? Then you better have a plan that goes beyond beating up street thugs in alleys, because whoever's running this operation, they play for keeps. Maya spent the afternoon at her desk, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about Popo's stories of growing up in a China torn apart by war and occupation, where survival often meant knowing when to hide and when to fight. She thought about James Wheeler, dead at 34 for asking the wrong questions. She thought about Mrs. Kim, driven out of the neighborhood she'd served for decades. At 5:30, she locked her desk and walked home through streets that looked different now that she understood the scope of what she was facing. Every boarded window, every closed shop, every for sale sign was part of a larger picture, a systematic campaign to hollow out communities and remake them for profit. But Maya also noticed other things. The new mural was still there, and someone had added to it a line of text in smaller letters that read, "We see you. We remember." Children were playing in the small park near her apartment, their laughter cutting through the evening air like a promise. And in the window of the old hardware store that had been closed for months, there was a sign, "Reopening soon, under new community management." That night, Maya sat at her kitchen table with all of her files spread out before her. Police reports, property records, client interviews, photographs from her evening walks. The evidence of what was happening was overwhelming, but the evidence of who was responsible remained frustratingly circumstantial. She thought about Sandra's words, "You can't do it alone." Maya had been operating as a lone wolf since returning to Little Harbor, documenting problems and fighting battles one case at a time. But wolves were pack animals, and the most dangerous predators could only be brought down by coordinated action. Maya opened her laptop and began typing. Subject: Community Meeting, Fighting Back Together. Dear neighbors, many of you know me as Maya Chen, Popo's granddaughter. I've been documenting what's happening in our neighborhood. The harassment, the intimidation, the systematic effort to drive us out of our homes. I've learned that we're not alone. Other communities have faced the same tactics from the same people. Some have fought back successfully, others have been destroyed. The difference was organization. If you're tired of being afraid in your own neighborhood, if you're sick of watching businesses close and families move away, if you want to fight back, meet me this Saturday at 7 p.m. in the community room at St. Mary's Church on Cedar Street. Come alone or bring friends. Bring your stories, your evidence, your anger, but also bring your hope. It's time to take back our neighborhood. Maya Chen. She sent the email to every address she'd collected over the past months. Clients, neighbors, shop owners, anyone who'd expressed frustration with what was happening to Little Harbor. Then she leaned back in her chair and tried to imagine what Popo would think of her granddaughter declaring war on forces that had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their interests. Outside her window, the city hummed with its nighttime energy. Somewhere out there, the men she'd left zip-tied in the alley were probably planning their revenge. Somewhere else, executives at Meridian Holdings were reviewing acquisition reports and profit projections. But in Little Harbor, in apartments and houses where families were afraid to walk their own streets, people were reading Maya's email and making decisions that would reshape everything. Maya closed her laptop and prepared for bed, but sleep felt impossible. In 3 days, she would find out whether her neighborhood was ready to fight back, or whether she just made herself the most visible target in a war she was finally beginning to understand. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth and the kind of golden light that made even the most tired urban landscapes look like they might hold possibility.
Maya arrived at St. Mary's 30 minutes early, her messenger bag now containing something more than incident reports and photographs. It held copies of her research, contact information for sympathetic journalists, and a detailed plan that had kept her awake for 3 straight nights. The community room was in the basement of the old stone church, a space that had hosted everything from AA meetings to quinceañera planning sessions. Father Miguel had handed over the keys without questions when Maya had approached him earlier in the week, his weathered face creasing into the kind of smile that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to organize what everyone knew needed to happen. "My congregation has been shrinking," he told her, gesturing toward the empty pews visible through his office window. "Not because people are losing faith, but because they're losing hope. Maybe it's time to give them something to believe in again." By 6:45, Maya was beginning to worry that she'd miscalculated. The basement room felt cavernous and empty, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls as she arranged folding chairs in a circle. She'd prepared for a crowd, but what if no one came? What if fear had won and Little Harbor's residents had decided that fighting back was too dangerous? Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Patterson appeared first, clutching her purse with both hands, but walking with determined steps. Behind her came the Nguyen family, all 4 generations from elderly grandmother to toddler grandson. Maria Santos followed, still wearing her restaurant apron and smelling of garlic and hope. By 7:15, 37 people had filled the basement room. Maya recognized most of them. Clients from the legal aid clinic, shop owners she'd interviewed, neighbors from her evening walks. But there were others too, faces she didn't know but who carried the same mixture of exhaustion and anger that had been growing in Little Harbor like a slow-burning fire. "Thank you all for coming," Maya began, standing in the center of the circle. "I know it took courage to be here tonight." An older man near the back, Maya thought his name was Carlos, though she wasn't certain, raised his hand. "Before we start, I want to know something. Are you the one who left those guys zip-tied in the alley?" The room went completely silent. Maya could feel the weight of 37 pairs of eyes, each person measuring her response, deciding whether she was someone they could trust or someone who would bring more trouble to their already troubled lives. "Yes," Maya said simply. The silence stretched for another heartbeat, then Carlos smiled, the first genuine smile Maya had seen from him in all their brief encounters. "Good," he said. "It's about time someone fought back." The dam broke. Stories poured out of the assembled neighbors like water through a burst pipe, each person's experience connecting to the larger picture Maya had been piecing together for months. Mrs. Rodriguez described men following her teenage daughter home from school, making crude comments and veiled threats. The daughter had stopped walking alone, then stopped going to school regularly, and was now talking about dropping out entirely. Tommy Wright, the same Tommy who'd been part of the group that confronted Maya in the alley, stood up near the back of the room. Maya's hand moved instinctively toward her phone, ready to call for help, but Tommy's posture was different now. Smaller, ashamed. "I need to say something," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was one of the guys who tried to scare you. They told us it was just business, that we were helping clean up the neighborhood." The room buzzed with angry murmurs, but Maya held up her hand for quiet. "What changed your mind?" "My little sister. She's 8. Last week, she asked me why the kids at school were saying mean things about where we live. She wanted to know if we were the bad guys." His voice cracked. "I couldn't answer her." "Tommy had been recruited 6 months ago," he explained, when he'd been facing eviction and couldn't find steady work. A man in an expensive suit had offered him $500 a week to keep an eye on the neighborhood and make sure troublemakers understood the consequences of stirring up problems. "I never called it intimidation," Tommy said. "Always made it sound like we were protecting people. But after what happened in the alley, I started paying attention to what we were actually doing."
Maya felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Who recruited you? Called himself Mr. Davidson, but I heard one of the other guys call him Vinny once when they thought I wasn't listening. Vincent Torrino. Sandra had been right. Maya had kicked a hornet's nest that went far higher than she'd imagined, but she'd also apparently cracked it, because now she had someone on the inside willing to talk. The stories continued. Elena Vasquez, who owned a small grocery store on 3rd Street, described how city inspectors had started showing up weekly, always finding new violations that required expensive fixes. The costs were bankrupting her family, but when she tried to fight the citations, she'd been told that cooperation was easier than litigation. Daniel Kim, Mrs. Kim's son who'd been trying to reopen the Sunrise laundromat, stood up with shaking hands. "They killed my mother," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. The room went dead silent. Maya felt her blood turn to ice. "The official cause was a heart attack," Daniel continued, "but she was healthy, she was strong. She died 3 days after they told her the laundromat property had been condemned and she had 48 hours to vacate." He pulled out a manila envelope and emptied its contents onto the nearest table. Medical records, property documents, and a series of photographs showing Mrs. Kim's apartment in the days before her death. "Look at the timestamps," Daniel said. "These photos were taken by a neighbor who was worried about her. The last one is from the night before she died." Maya examined the photographs. They showed Mrs. Kim's normally immaculate apartment in chaos, furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered, windows broken. It looked like the aftermath of a violent struggle, not the peaceful passing of an elderly woman. "Did you report this to the police?" "Of course. They said there was no evidence of foul play. Said elderly people sometimes have accidents, knock things over when they're not feeling well." Daniel's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd learned that justice was a luxury he couldn't afford. "But my mother didn't have any accidents, and she sure as hell didn't die of fear." Maya looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors, people who'd been isolated by terror, convinced they were alone in their struggles. But they weren't alone anymore, and the scope of what they were facing was becoming clear. "Here's what I think is happening," Maya said, moving to the front of the room where she had set up a large piece of poster board. "This isn't a random crime. It's not even traditional organized crime. It's systematic community destruction designed to drive down property values and force people out." She began drawing connections on the poster board, Meridian holdings in the center, with lines radiating out to property acquisitions, harassment campaigns, city officials, and what Tommy called Mr. Davidson. "They're using fear as a business model. Scare people to leave, buy their properties at below market prices, and then revitalize the neighborhood for wealthier residents." Carlos stood up again. "So what do we do about it? Call the police? Write letters to the mayor? Because I hate to break it to you, but some of us have been trying that for months." Maya had been dreading this question because the answer was going to sound insane. But sitting in that basement room, surrounded by people who'd lost businesses and homes, and in Mrs. Kim's case, their lives, insane was starting to sound reasonable. "We fight back," she said, "but not the way they expect us to."
Over the next hour, Maya outlined her plan. It was complex, dangerous, and required a level of coordination that would test every relationship in the room. But it was also their only chance to save Little Harbor before it was completely hollowed out. The plan had 3 phases. First, they would document everything. Every incident of harassment, every suspicious property transaction, every connection between Meridian Holdings and city officials. Maya had been doing this alone, but with 37 people coordinating, they could build a case that would be impossible to ignore. Second, they would disrupt the harassment campaign. This was where Maya's confrontation in the alley fit into a larger strategy. "They're counting on us being afraid," she explained. "So we stop being afraid. We travel in groups, we carry cameras, we make noise when they try to intimidate us."
The third phase was the most dangerous. They would go after the money. Meridian Holdings is a business, Maya said. Businesses care about profit margins and public relations. If we can make their operations in Little Harbor expensive and embarrassing, they'll move on to easier targets. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. That sounds good in theory, dear, but these people have already shown they're willing to kill. What happens when we start costing them money? It was the question Maya had been asking herself for days. The honest answer was that she didn't know, but she did know what would happen if they did nothing. Mrs. Kim is dead, Maya said simply. How many more of us have to die before we decide the risk of fighting back is worth taking? The room buzzed with quiet conversations as neighbors turned to each other, weighing fear against hope, safety against principle. Maya watched their faces and tried to read the decision forming in the collective consciousness of her community. Tommy Wright stood up again. I can help, he said. I know their schedules, their routines. I know when they're planning operations. That's incredibly dangerous for you, Maya warned. So is doing nothing, and so is letting them turn my neighborhood into something my little sister has to be ashamed of. One by one, others began volunteering. Elena would use her store as a communication hub. Carlos would organize the men in the neighborhood into walking patrols. The Nguyen family would coordinate with other immigrant families who'd been targeted. Daniel Kim would handle media outreach, using his mother's story to bring attention to what was happening. By 9:30, they had the foundation of a resistance movement. Maya felt a mixture of exhalation and terror as she looked around the room at people who'd arrived as isolated victims and were leaving as organized opponents. But as the meeting broke up and neighbors filtered back onto the streets of Little Harbor, Maya knew that their real troubles were just beginning. Meridian Holdings and Vincent Torrino had been operating in the shadows, relying on fear and isolation to maintain control. Now, they were about to face organized opposition, and organizations like theirs didn't typically respond to challenges with reason and compromise. Maya was the last to leave the church basement, turning off lights and stacking chairs while her mind raced through contingency plans and worst-case scenarios. As she climbed the stairs to street level, she could hear voices outside. Not the casual conversation of neighbors heading home, but something sharper, more urgent. She peered through the glass doors of the church's main entrance and felt her blood freeze. 6 men were standing on the sidewalk outside, and Maya recognized 4 of them from her encounter in the alley. They were back on their feet, apparently recovered from their zip tie experience, and they'd brought friends. But they weren't alone. Standing between the men and the church doors were Carlos, Daniel Kim, and Tommy Wright. Tommy was talking rapidly, his hands gesturing in what looked like either explanation or argument. Maya couldn't hear the words, but the body language told a clear story. Tommy was trying to convince his former associates to leave, and they weren't interested in listening. Maya pulled out her phone and speed-dialed Sandra. I need you to call the police and report a disturbance at St. Mary's Church on Cedar Street, she said when Sandra answered. Multiple men threatening parishioners. Maya, Just do it. And if you don't hear from me in 20 minutes, call Father Miguel and tell him to check the church basement. Maya hung up before Sandra could argue. She moved through the church sanctuary toward a side door that would let her exit closer to the confrontation. As a child, she'd explored every corner of St. Mary's during long Sunday services, and she knew the building's layout better than most people knew their own homes. The side door opened onto a narrow alley that ran along the church's eastern wall. Maya could hear the voices more clearly now, and the conversation was escalating rapidly. You made your choice, Tommy. Can't take it back now. I'm not asking to take anything back. I'm asking you to leave these people alone.
These people? Brother, these people just declared war on us. You think we're going to walk away because you got religion? Maya crept along the alley until she could see the confrontation. The 6 men had formed a loose semicircle, with Tommy, Carlos, and Daniel trapped between them and the church doors. Other neighbors were visible in the background, hesitating at the edges of the conflict, unsure whether to help or run. Maya's hand moved to her phone, but she knew the police wouldn't arrive in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. The men weren't just there to intimidate, they were there to send a message that would end the resistance movement before it could gain momentum. She thought about Popo's stories of the war, about communities that had survived occupation by becoming something harder than their oppressors expected. Sometimes Popo had said, the only way to protect what you love is to become what your enemies fear most. Maya emerged from the alley and walked toward the confrontation with the measured pace of someone arriving exactly on time for an appointment. The men turned as they noticed her approach, and she could see recognition dawning on their faces. "Gentlemen," Maya said, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I believe you're lost." The leader of the group, not one of the original 5, but someone newer and more dangerous, smiled with a kind of confidence that came from never losing a fight that mattered. "Actually, I think we're exactly where we need to be." Maya counted her allies. Tommy, whose commitment was genuine, but whose fighting experience was limited. Carlos, who was strong, but in his 60s. Daniel, who was angry, but had never been in a real fight in his life. Against 6 men, who were younger, larger, and almost certainly armed. Math was impossible, but Maya had learned long ago that mathematics was only one way to solve problems. "Before this goes any further," Maya said, "you should know that I've called the police. They'll be here in about 5 minutes.
The leader laughed. 5 minutes is more time than we need. You're probably right, Maya agreed. But I should also mention that Daniel has been live streaming this entire conversation to his social media accounts. 23 people are watching right now. Daniel, bless him, was quick enough to catch on and held up his phone, pointing its camera at the group of men. Maya could see the leader's confidence waver slightly as he realized that whatever happened next would be recorded and shared. "Turn off the camera," the leader ordered. "I don't think so," Daniel replied. And Maya heard something in his voice that reminded her of Mrs. Kim, the quiet strength of someone who decided that some things were worth the risk. "You've got about 30 seconds to walk away," Maya said. "After that, this situation becomes very different for everyone involved." "Are you threatening us?" Maya smiled and felt Popo's spirit flowing through her like electricity through water. "I'm making you a promise." The leader reached into his jacket, and Maya saw the outline of something that wasn't a phone or a wallet. Around her, she could feel the tension ratcheting up like a spring under pressure. But then Tommy Wright did something that changed everything. He stepped forward, placing himself between the leader and Maya, and began speaking in a voice loud enough for Daniel's phone to pick up clearly. "My name is Thomas Wright," he said. 6 months ago, I was recruited by Vincent Torrino's organization to intimidate residents of Little Harbor. I was paid $500 a week to harass families, threaten business owners, and make people afraid to live in their own neighborhood." The leader's face went white. "Shut up, Tommy." Tonight, these people had a community meeting to organize resistance to systematic harassment and property theft. Now, 6 men with weapons are threatening them for exercising their constitutional right to assembly. Maya realized what Tommy was doing. He was creating a record that would make it impossible for Torrino's organization to simply disappear the witnesses. If something happened to the people gathered outside St. Mary's, Tommy's confession would provide motive and suspects. "Shut up, Tommy." The leader pulled a gun from his jacket. That's when Maya moved. The next 90 seconds would be remembered differently by everyone who witnessed them. Carlos would later describe it as like watching a storm made of human parts. Daniel would post a video that went viral within hours, though most viewers assumed it was staged because the movement was too fast and too precise to be real. But Tommy Wright, who was closest to the action, would remember it most clearly. He would remember the way Maya seemed to flow between the men like water, her hands finding pressure points and joint locks with surgical precision. He would remember the sound of weapons hitting pavement and the rhythmic impacts of bodies following them down. Mostly, he would remember the silence that followed, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different kind of order, one where the people who belonged in Little Harbor were standing and the people who didn't belong were learning what the ground felt like. When the police arrived 4 minutes later, they found 6 men zip-tied to various pieces of street furniture, all conscious, but none of them particularly interested in explaining what had happened. They also found 37 residents of Little Harbor who'd suddenly discovered that their neighborhood might be worth fighting for after all. Detective Sarah Martinez had been working Little Harbor cases for 8 years, long enough to recognize patterns that existed in shadows and silences. The call about multiple suspects restrained outside St. Mary's Church was her third this month involving similar circumstances. Groups of men found zip-tied and unwilling to explain how they'd ended up that way. Maya watched from the church steps as Detective Martinez methodically documented the scene, photographing the restraints, interviewing witnesses, and collecting the weapons that had been scattered across the sidewalk like deadly confetti. The detective's movements were precise and professional, but Maya caught the way her eyes lingered on details that told a story beyond what appeared in any official report. "Miss Chen," Detective Martinez said, approaching with a notebook that had seen too many similar scenes, "I understand that you organized tonight's community meeting." "That's correct." "And these 6 men just happened to be waiting outside when it ended?" Maya glanced toward Daniel Kim, who was still holding his phone with the steadiness of someone who understood that documentation was sometimes the only justice available. "Detective, I think you should see what Mr. Kim recorded." The video was 18 minutes long, but the crucial parts took less than 3 to watch. Tommy's confession, the leader drawing a weapon, Maya's response. Detective Martinez watched it twice, her expression carefully neutral, then looked up at the assembled residents. "Mr. Wright," she said, addressing Tommy directly, "you mentioned Vincent Torrino. Are you willing to make an official statement about your involvement with his organization?" Tommy's face went pale, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand that such a statement would put you at considerable personal risk?" "Detective, I think we're all at considerable personal risk. At least this way, maybe we can do something about it." Detective Martinez spent the next 2 hours taking statements from witnesses and suspects. The 6 men claimed they'd been attacked without provocation, but their stories contradicted each other and failed to explain the weapons or their presence outside a community meeting. Tommy's confession, corroborated by the video evidence, painted a picture of systematic intimidation that connected to cases Detective Martinez had been investigating across 3 precincts. By midnight, the suspects were in custody, and the residents of Little Harbor were finally walking home through streets that felt different, not safe exactly, but no longer completely under someone else's control. Maya was the last to give her statement, standing in the empty church sanctuary while Detective Martinez asked the same questions she'd heard from other officers after her previous encounters with Torrino's men. "Miss Chen, in your statement, you mentioned that you've been documenting incidents of harassment in this neighborhood for several months. I'd like to see that documentation." Maya pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photographs, incident reports, and recorded conversations. As Detective Martinez reviewed the evidence, her carefully maintained professional expression began to crack. "Jesus," the detective muttered. "How long has this been going on?" "The systematic campaign? About 18 months, but the harassment has been escalating for the past 6 months. "And you've reported this to the local police?" "Multiple times.
The reports seemed to disappear or get classified as isolated incidents with no connection to larger patterns.
Detective Martinez looked up from Maya's phone with the expression of someone who'd been carrying a heavy weight and had just realized she didn't have to carry it alone. "Ms. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you working with any law enforcement agencies? FBI? State police?" "No." "Why?" "Because the evidence you've collected is better than anything we've been able to develop through official channels, and because I've been investigating Vincent Torrino for 3 years without getting close to the kind of proof you've assembled in 6 months." Maya felt the world shifting again, but this time toward possibility rather than danger. "You've been investigating Torrino?" "Multi-jurisdictional task force. He's been using the same tactics in neighborhoods across the state, but we've never been able to connect the harassment campaigns to his organization. Witnesses disappear or recant their statements. Evidence gets lost or compromised. Officials get transferred or decide to retire early." Detective Martinez closed her notebook and looked directly at Maya. "But tonight, with Mr. Wright's confession and Mr. Kim's video, we finally have something that might stick." Over the next week, Maya's carefully organized life exploded into chaos that felt oddly like progress. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, community organizers from other neighborhoods, and lawyers offering to represent residents in civil suits against Meridian Holdings. Sandra had moved into Maya's apartment temporarily, bringing enough clothes and legal books to suggest that temporary might last longer than either of them admitted. She'd taken leave from her job at the courthouse to help coordinate the media response and legal strategy that was rapidly developing around Tommy's confession. 17 neighborhoods, Sandra announced on Thursday morning, dumping a stack of newspapers on Maya's kitchen table. That's how many communities have reported similar harassment campaigns in the past 2 years. Maya examined the headlines. Neighborhood Watch Group exposes systematic intimidation campaign. Local activist uncovers multi-million-dollar property scheme. Community fights back against corporate harassment. The story was spreading beyond Little Harbor, connecting dots that law enforcement agencies across 3 states had been unable or unwilling to connect on their own. Tommy's confession had opened floodgates, and other witnesses were coming forward with stories that painted a picture of corruption that reached into city halls, police departments, and courthouses. "There's more," Sandra said, pulling out a thick folder. "Remember that business card Mrs. Patterson showed you? The one from Meridian Holdings?" Maya nodded. "I ran the company name through property records databases. In the past 18 months, Meridian Holdings has acquired over 200 properties in targeted neighborhoods, usually at 30 to 50% below market value." The math was staggering. Even conservative estimates suggested that Torrino's organization had generated over $40 million in profits by systematically terrorizing communities and forcing distressed sales. But here's the interesting part. Meridian Holdings is a shell company. The actual owner is listed as Coastal Development Partners, which is owned by Harbor Investment Group, which is controlled by something called Trinity Holdings. How deep does it go? All the way to the top. Trinity Holdings is controlled by 3 silent partners, but I was able to trace 2 of them through public records. Sandra pulled out a sheet of paper covered with financial flowcharts and corporate connections. One is Vincent Torrino. The other is Deputy Mayor Robert Hutchinson.
Maya stared at the paper, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Deputy Mayor Hutchinson had been the public face of several urban revitalization initiatives that had resulted in the displacement of long-term residents from neighborhoods that were subsequently developed into luxury housing. So the city government is directly profiting from the harassment campaigns? It gets worse.
The third partner is listed as an anonymous LLC, but the registered address is the same as Hutchinson's law firm. I think we're looking at a city official, an organized crime figure, and probably several other politicians working together to systematically loot entire neighborhoods. Maya's phone rang. Detective Martinez's name appeared on the screen, along with a photo they'd taken last week during one of their evidence review sessions. "Miss Chen, I need you to come to the station. We've made an arrest." "Torrino?" "Better. Deputy Mayor Hutchinson. Turns out your friend Mr. Wright recorded some very interesting conversations during his time working for the organization." Maya and Sandra arrived at the police station to find a media circus in progress. News vans lined the street. Reporters were doing live broadcasts from the front steps, and a crowd of residents from Little Harbor and other affected neighborhoods had gathered to witness what many were calling the biggest corruption scandal in the city's history. Inside, Detective Martinez led them to a conference room where Tommy Wright was sitting with a man Maya didn't recognize. Expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, the kind of lawyer who charged by the minute and earned every penny. "Miss Chen," the lawyer said, rising to shake her hand, "I'm David Patterson with the State Attorney General's office. Mr. Wright has been extremely helpful in our investigation." Tommy looked older than he had a week ago, the weight of confession and cooperation etched into lines around his eyes. But there was something else there, too. A sense of relief that came from finally being on the right side of a fight that had been eating at his conscience for months. "I've been wearing a wire for the past 4 days," Tommy said without preamble. "Detective Martinez convinced me that the best way to protect my sister and everyone else in Little Harbor was to help build a case that would put these people away permanently." Patterson opened a briefcase and pulled out a digital recorder. "We've documented conversations that implicate not just Vincent Torrino and Deputy Mayor Hutchinson, but at least 6 other city officials, 3 police supervisors, and 2 judges." Maya felt her knees go weak. The scope of the corruption was beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd started documenting harassment in her neighborhood. How long has this been going on? "Based on the evidence we've gathered, at least 5 years, possibly longer." Patterson pressed play on the recorder, and Vincent Torrino's voice filled the room with casual discussions of bribery, intimidation, and murder that made Maya's skin crawl. "The beauty of the system is that it's technically legal. We're not stealing property, we're buying it at fair market value. The fact that we've driven down the market value through targeted community degradation is just good business." Another voice, one Patterson identified as Deputy Mayor Hutchinson, laughed. "The rezoning applications alone have generated over $3 million in permit fees. The city is actually making money while we're making money. And if anyone gets too curious, we have people in place to handle problems. Sometimes it's just a matter of transferring a detective to a different precinct. Sometimes it requires more permanent solutions." Maya thought about Mrs. Kim, about James Wheeler from Riverside, about all the people who'd been more permanent solutions to the problem of community resistance.
"Miss Chen," Patterson said, "we'd like you to testify before a grand jury next week. Your documentation has been crucial in establishing the pattern of systematic harassment that allowed this organization to operate. Of course, you should know that the defense will probably try to paint you as a vigilante who took the law into her own hands. Your encounters with Torrino's men will be used to suggest that you're not a credible witness." Maya looked around the room, at Tommy, who'd risked his life to wear a wire, Detective Martinez, who'd been fighting corruption for years, Sandra, who'd given up her job to help coordinate their legal strategy. "Let him try," she said. "I've got the best backup a vigilante could ask for." Over the next month, the story continued to evolve in ways that surprised everyone involved. Grand jury indictments came down against 17 defendants, including Vincent Torrino, Deputy Mayor Hutchinson, and Police Captain James Morrison, who'd been responsible for burying harassment reports and intimidating victims who tried to come forward. But the most significant development happened in Little Harbor itself. The community meeting at St. Mary's had been the beginning, not the end, of neighborhood organization. Weekly meetings drew larger crowds, and residents began coordinating efforts that went beyond resistance to systematic intimidation. Elena Vasquez reopened her grocery store, this time with a community investment fund that kept ownership local and profits in the neighborhood. The Nguyen family organized English classes and citizenship workshops that drew families from across the harbor district. Daniel Kim secured permits to reopen the Sunrise Laundromat as a community-owned cooperative, with Mrs. Kim's original children's artwork restored to the front windows. Maya found herself serving as an unofficial coordinator for activities that ranged from neighborhood watch patrols to property law workshops. Her evening walks had transformed from solitary evidence-gathering missions to community organizing rounds, where she checked in with families, mediated disputes, and helped connect people with resources they needed. The most surprising development was Tommy Wright, who'd become something like a community ombudsman. His experience working for Torrino's organization gave him insights into how harassment campaigns operated, and he'd developed a talent for identifying and disrupting harassment before it escalated. "The thing is," Tommy explained to Maya during one of their weekly coffee meetings at Elena's store, "most of these guys aren't evil. They're just broke and scared and looking for someone to tell them what to do. When you give them something better to do, most of them take it." Tommy had been right. 3 other men who'd worked for Torrino's organization had come forward after seeing the community changes in Little Harbor. They'd provided additional evidence for the prosecution and had begun helping other neighborhoods recognize and resist similar campaigns. But Maya knew that their victory was incomplete. Vincent Torrino and Deputy Mayor Hutchinson were in jail, but the economic forces that made neighborhoods vulnerable to systematic harassment were still operating. Meridian Holdings had been dissolved, but other companies were already moving into the profitable space between community desperation and urban development. The real test would come when the media attention faded, and Little Harbor had to sustain its transformation through the long, slow work of building something better than what they'd lost. On a Thursday evening in November, Maya was walking her old route through the neighborhood when she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. The wall where she had first seen the message, "This is our home, we are not afraid," was painted again. The new mural covered the entire side of the building, a riot of color and images that told the story of Little Harbor's resistance and renewal. Maya could see her grandmother's face. Crowd of portraits. Mrs. Kim standing beside her newest English students. Tommy Wright teaching a group of children how to recognize when adults were trying to scare them. At the center of the mural, in letters visible from 3 blocks away, was a message in multiple languages. "We see you. We remember. We are not afraid." Maya pulled out her phone to take a photograph, then realized she didn't need to document this moment. For the first time in months, she was witnessing something that was happening because of hope rather than fear, creation rather than destruction. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. Grand jury vote came back. 17 indictments approved. Vincent Torrino is looking at 25 to life. Maya smiled and typed back, "Good. Time to build something worth protecting." Maya Chen returned to Little Harbor, the neighborhood where she grew up with her grandmother Popo, to find a community under siege. What had once been a vibrant, diverse working-class neighborhood was being systematically destroyed through a corporate harassment campaign orchestrated by Vincent Torrino and his company Meridian Holdings. The harassment was brutal and calculated. Armed men intimidating residents, elderly people being pushed downstairs, windows broken, and businesses vandalized. All designed to drive people out so developers could buy properties cheaply and gentrify the area. The campaign had already claimed victims. Mrs. Kim, an elderly Korean woman who had run the Sunrise Laundromat for decades, died of a heart attack after refusing to sell her building to harassers. Her death became a catalyst for community resistance, as residents realized they were facing an organized threat that required an organized response. Maya, who worked at a legal aid clinic, began documenting the harassment while walking through the neighborhood each evening. She carried Popo's jade ring and memories of her grandmother's stories about village organizing during wartime, lessons about communities surviving by taking care of each other when larger institutions failed them. The first community meeting was held in the basement of St. Mary's Church, where 37 scared and angry residents gathered to share their experiences of harassment. What emerged was a pattern of systematic intimidation involving fake utility inspections, frivolous legal challenges, and street-level violence designed to create fear and desperation.
Key figures emerged as natural leaders: Sandra, a courthouse clerk with legal knowledge; Elena Vasquez, who ran a grocery store struggling; Carlos Martinez, an elderly man whose family had lived in the neighborhood for generations; and surprisingly, Tommy Wright, a teenager who had been recruited as part of the harassment campaign but decided to switch sides and help the community instead. Maya developed a systematic approach to resistance, documenting every incident of harassment, building relationships between neighbors who had been isolated by fear, and creating communication networks that allowed rapid response to threats. The community learned to turn individual vulnerability into collective strength. The organizing efforts led to increasingly dangerous confrontations with Torrino's men. Maya was personally threatened and physically attacked, but the community's growing solidarity meant that harassers could no longer isolate individual victims. Neighbors began accompanying each other to stores, elderly residents were never left alone, and children walked to school in groups. The breakthrough came when Maya gathered enough evidence to involve law enforcement, particularly Detective Martinez, who had been investigating similar harassment campaigns in other neighborhoods. The FBI became involved when it became clear that Torrino's operation was part of a larger network of corporate corruption involving city officials. The criminal case revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Meridian Holdings had been operating systematic harassment campaigns in multiple cities, working with corrupt government officials to manipulate property markets. Vincent Torrino was eventually sentenced to 27 years in prison, while Deputy Mayor Hutchinson received 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. Victory in court was only the beginning of Little Harbor's transformation. The community realized that defeating one threat wasn't enough. They needed to build lasting structures that would protect them from future exploitation. Sandra proposed creating a community land trust, a legal mechanism that would keep property ownership in community hands and prevent outside developers from displacing residents.
The land trust became the foundation for broader community development. Over time, it gained control of dozens of properties, including apartment buildings, small businesses, and community spaces. Properties in the trust couldn't be sold to outside developers, couldn't be flipped for profit, and couldn't be used to displace long-term residents. Elena's grocery store became the anchor for a cooperative business network that eventually included multiple stores throughout the Harbor District. Tommy Wright, the former participant in the harassment campaign, became a community educator, teaching conflict resolution and organizing skills to young people. As Little Harbor's success became known, other neighborhoods facing similar threats began adapting their strategies. Maya found herself consulting with communities across the country, helping them recognize the early warning signs of systematic harassment and develop organizing responses before situations reached crisis points. The legal aid clinic expanded to include a community defense project that provided training in tenant rights, property law, and community organizing. Maya was promoted to supervise the project, allowing her to hire staff and develop programs rather than simply responding to crises. Jennifer Wu, a recent law school graduate whose research had identified similar corporate harassment schemes in 18 other cities, joined the project and brought academic rigor to work that had previously relied on street-level experience and instincts. The organizing strategies developed in Little Harbor began influencing policy at multiple levels. Community land trusts spread to dozens of cities, protecting thousands of families from displacement. The legal strategies developed by Sandra were used to challenge corporate harassment campaigns in multiple states. Most significantly, systematic harassment became recognized as a form of racketeering under federal law, making it easier to prosecute companies that used fear to manipulate property markets. The work culminated 20 years later when Congress passed the Community Self-Determination Act, providing federal funding for community land trusts and legal protection for neighborhood organizing. One of the most remarkable aspects of Little Harbor's transformation was how community organizing became embedded in the neighborhood's culture across generations. Children who grew up attending community meetings became adults who took community power for granted. They developed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of organizing strategies, creating games that taught conflict resolution and community defense skills. Tommy Wright's evolution exemplified this generational change. From a teenager recruited to harass neighbors, he became a community educator, completed his education, and eventually directed youth organizing programs that served neighborhoods across the country. His sister, who had been 8 years old during the harassment campaign, grew up to study social work with plans to continue the family's commitment to community organizing. The Little Harbor model didn't remain isolated. Over 25 years, it influenced community organizing efforts across continents. The strategies were adapted to address corporate land grabs in rural Kenya, gentrification in urban Brazil, and displacement threats in communities around the world. Maya found herself speaking at international conferences, sharing lessons learned from the Little Harbor experience with community organizers from 6 continents. The core principles remained consistent across cultural and geographic boundaries: build relationships, identify shared problems, organize collective responses. The network that grew out of Little Harbor's initial organizing efforts eventually included thousands of neighborhoods sharing strategies, resources, and solidarity. Universities began offering degree programs in community defense and development, institutionalizing knowledge that had emerged from grassroots struggle. The threats facing Little Harbor evolved over 25 years, requiring continuous adaptation of organizing strategies. After Torrino's arrest, companies like Hudson Bay Development attempted to use legal pressure rather than street-level intimidation. Community organizers responded by developing sophisticated legal strategies that made harassment campaigns financially unviable. Climate change brought new challenges, including unprecedented flooding that tested the neighborhood's resilience. The mutual aid networks and cooperative economy that had grown out of organizing against harassment proved effective in responding to environmental emergencies as well. The COVID-19 pandemic created economic disruption that might have devastated a less organized community. But Little Harbor's social connections and cooperative businesses helped families survive by sharing resources and supporting each other through the crisis. By the story's end, Little Harbor had achieved remarkable stability and prosperity while maintaining its character as a diverse, working-class neighborhood. The Community Land Trust controlled 80% of residential property, ensuring housing remained affordable while preventing speculation that would drive out long-term residents. The cooperative business network had expanded beyond grocery stores and laundromats to include child care centers, repair shops, and a community-owned bank providing microloans for residential entrepreneurs. Crime rates had decreased significantly as social connections strengthened and young people had meaningful roles in community governance. Most importantly, the neighborhood had developed what Maya called social infrastructure, the relationships and institutions that made it possible for people to take care of each other across differences of language, culture, and generation. Maya's personal journey paralleled the neighborhood's transformation. She began as a frightened woman walking alone through dangerous streets, documenting problems she felt powerless to solve. Through 25 years of organizing work, she became an internationally recognized expert on community organizing, speaking at conferences and consulting with communities around the world. But her most important role remained local, taking evening walks through Little Harbor, checking in with families, mediating disputes, and helping newcomers understand the neighborhood's culture of mutual aid and collective responsibility. These walks evolved from solitary evidence gathering to community celebrations, with children joining her to practice conflict resolution skills and elderly residents sharing updates on neighborhood projects. The story of Little Harbor offers several crucial lessons about community organizing and social change. When people build relationships, identify shared problems, and organize collective responses, they can protect themselves from systematic exploitation and build alternatives that serve community needs. Over 25 years, Little Harbor faced corporate harassment, legal pressure, climate emergencies, and economic disruption. The specific tactics had to adapt, but the underlying principles of relationship building and collective action remained effective. Maya's decision to document harassment in her neighborhood eventually influenced federal legislation and international organizing strategies. Personal courage, when connected to community organizing, can have far-reaching impacts. Popo's stories about village organizing during wartime provided the foundation for Maya's work, which was then passed down to new generations who adapted it to contemporary challenges. Rather than waiting for outside institutions to solve their problems, Little Harbor demonstrated that communities could organize effectively enough to protect themselves and build better alternatives.
25 years after that first desperate meeting in a church basement, Little Harbor had become a model for community-controlled development that influenced policy and organizing strategies around the world. Children who had grown up during the harassment campaign were now adults raising their own children in a neighborhood that prioritized cooperation over competition.
Maya's final reflection, standing beside Popo's grave, overlooking the transformed neighborhood, captured the essence of what had been accomplished. Community organizing hadn't solved every problem or eliminated every threat, but it had created communities that were strong enough to protect themselves, connected enough to support each other, and organized enough to adapt to whatever challenges emerged. The work continued, as it always had and always would, but now it continued with the knowledge that communities could organize effectively enough to protect themselves, that individual actions could create collective change, and that even the most desperate circumstances could be transformed when people remembered how to take care of each other. Popo's lessons about village organizing had found new expression in urban community defense, proving that the human capacity to adapt, organize, and care for each other could overcome even the most systematic forms of exploitation and build something better in its place. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.